Hey everyone. So we're starting the full color block in, and the first thing that I wanted to show you was the palette that we're using for this painting. I'll bring this in a little bit larger. You can see I've left some of my limited palette colors on there, the pure colors, just because some of them are still good. I've uncovered my umbers, my raw umber and my burn umber and my ivory black, just because I do use those sometimes to help desaturate colors when I'm working with these bright colors. And I used a little bit of the umbers to touch into some of my shadows sometimes as well. I've lined up my colors so that I have my warms on this side of the three primaries and my cools on this side. So what we have is an alizarin crimson right here, that's our cool red. You have the cadmium red light, that's our warm red. We have the cadmium yellow light, which is our cool yellow. Our cadmium yellow medium, which is our warm yellow. We've got ultramarine blue, which is our cool blue, and phthalo blue green shade, which is our warm blue. I'm going to use these three colors mixing between them. Sometimes what I'll do is when I mix colors, if you think about it, if you mix like your cool version to your warm version of these two colors, the warm blue to the cool yellow, you're going to get a better green than if you mix like your cool blue to your warm yellow. They're farther away from each other on the color wheel, so you really want to pay attention to those placements on the color wheel. As things get farther away from each other, even though you think mixing yellow and blue together is going to make green, you'll get different versions of green, and that's actually really helpful to know as you're trying to match some of the tones and colors that you're using within your painting. So let's move this out of the way. I'm going to go to this right here, and let's make it full screen just so it's a little bit easier to see it. I'm going to control the movement on this just so that it's a little bit, it moved too fast if I didn't. So I did this as stop motion this time in the hopes it would make a little lower quality, a lower res video with all the quality that I need. I figure you don't need every second of me painting. So we've started out, we've got the full lay-in back here, and I did this all in one day. So I did the lay-in that morning, so the lay-in is still damp, and that's kind of important to know because you can see we've got some fairly like darker tones happening sometimes, and sometimes I lay them in more like this. I just happen to have a little bit more paint on my brush. I probably should have controlled it a little bit better if I was going to work on it the same day. So these tones that we've got in the shadows are definitely going to affect our colors as we lay in, but if you use it correctly, it's really helpful too. I started with some alizarin crimson, and I'm letting that wet tone in the background kind of mix into what I'm doing with the alizarin because this is a shadow area. One thing that you're not going to automatically know, but it's something that I know, is that the alizarin crimson blends really well into some of these dark tones, especially this mixture of burnt umber and ultramarine blue that we used for that underpainting. So it mixes well. It doesn't make it too muddy. It just makes it darker and makes it feel like a richer, more maroon tone. So that's kind of nice. And I might have picked up, I can't remember because I did this a couple days ago, but I might have even picked up a dab of black. Alizarin crimson mixes really well with the ivory black as well because it's so, the alizarin crimson is so transparent. The ivory black is semi-transparent. And the alizarin crimson is such a cool red. So the blueness of the black doesn't bother it at all. I blocked in this back area, which is basically my shadow part of the drapery, and just kind of got some of those shadows going, starting off there. I used the same brush, so it's a little bit dirty with that red in it, but I picked up a little bit of the cadmium red and mixed a little bit more alizarin crimson as well. And then I started blocking in the light area where the drapery is being hit by some light sources there in my background. I went down to the apple, and I kind of did the same thing. That apple has a lot of the same tones as the drapery. And so I used more of the alizarin crimson in the shadow area. And then I brought in some more of the cadmium red light and the warm reds later on when I worked into the light area. That's a plum down there on the bottom right. So it's got a lot of reds in it, but it also has a lot of grays and kind of violety tones to it. I did use some of the alizarin crimson in the shadow side on that. As I put the light into the apple, I needed to warm it up a bit, so I warmed that area up with that cadmium red. So this is kind of a great example of how you might use one completely different color in the shadow side and a whole other color in the light side to really give the appearance of light and shadow on one object. And that's kind of what I'm talking about when I tell you guys, don't think of an object as being something that you dip like in a vat of dye, and then you're going to get that one color, and then you're just going to make that color lighter and darker to represent the light and shadow. We work much differently with paint. And so with paint, what you want to think of is more like what tones will work well within my shadow side, what colors, and what colors will work well within the light side. And in this case, it's two totally different pigments that give you that nice effect. Whoops, we kind of skipped ahead there. So I blocked in that. I went down here and I made a little bit more of a pink tone for this plum, because it's definitely got a lot more like pink purple tones in it, and I wanted to differentiate it from the apple. So I used more of the alizarin crimson and just lightened the alizarin crimson, and I have a touch of the cadmium red in it because otherwise it gets really like purpley pink and it makes a tone that I didn't entirely want. So I used a touch of the cadmium red but more of the alizarin crimson and then a little bit of white to get that pink tone in the top of the plum. I came down here to the drapery, and the drapery is all very red. And so I use, when I'm doing red drapery, one of my typical kind of mixtures I'll use is a lot of alizarin crimson to block in the shadows. I might use a little bit of like an ultramarine blue and then a little bit of black in those shadows as well if I need to make them darker, or I want to tone down some of the red tone in the shadows. And then a lot of times I'll even go through the light side and I'll use the alizarin crimson very thinly and then work back into that with my cadmiums to give it the feel of the red drapery and so on, because I love the way that like the cadmium red mixes into the alizarin crimson. So you can kind of see there, right here, it's just the alizarin crimson, which is very transparent. And then I bring in a little bit of cadmium red into that, and you can see how the opacity and the warmth of the cadmium red starts to read already as like a light area. So I went through and started blocking in all of this drapery. That's where I've got a touch of white added into that cadmium red. As I lighten up the cadmium red, I do a couple things, and it kind of depends on what the final effect is that I want. Sometimes I use just the white mixed into it, but more often I use a touch of yellow in there as well. Either the warm or cool yellow, depending on how quickly I want to lighten it. The yellow allows it to become more of a peach tone rather than just a pink tone. So you can see here that we've definitely got a little bit of yellow going on in these red tints that I've added in. They're a little bit warmer tone than what's happening down here. Already you can see the difference in that. I blocked in, because I had the light on my brush, I went through and blocked in some of the other areas to not waste that paint that I had on there. And this first layer, it's very quick. This entire stop motion that I did of the first part of it is only 22 seconds, so it doesn't have a ton of photos in it. It's got what? I think they do like so many every second. So I think I did all of like a half hour, an hour on this lay-in all together. So you keep it. The reason I'm saying that is because I want you to understand that you keep this very simple. I don't use a lot of heavy paint, not at this point. I will use heavier paint as I get further into the block-in, and you'll see that as we look at some of the later photos. Unfortunately, I kind of messed up the second part of this videotaping, but at least we've got, or I didn't mess it up. I just switched over to Zoom, so I don't have it videotaped in the same way. But you can definitely see that these are very quick. Very loose lay-ins that are just meant to establish our planes in the beginning. So here I'm just kind of blocking in some of the edges of my drawing back in again. I'm getting some of the shadows back in there. I'm picking up variations of just the alizarin crimson. Sometimes I'm hitting like here a little bit more white into it. So I'm not like overly worrying about it, but I am trying to pay attention to some of these temperature shifts in areas. Up here I wanted to bring in some of the same light that I had down here, so I'm bringing that back into that looser kind of thin lay-in that I did with the cadmium red and the alizarin. And that dirty alizarin really. And I'm bringing in some whites in here, or some tints I should say, of the cadmium just to start getting that light feeling like it's hitting in that area. When I laid this in, I was going off the photo reference, and I kind of blocked it in the same as the photo reference. I did make a decision later that I'm just going to let this dry out, and I'm going to lock in this whole area as just a dark shadow in the background. So you're going to see me going through the process of blocking this in. I don't like how strong the shadow shape is. Even if I lighten it, I don't like this big shape in here. I decided at first I really liked it, and then later on I was like, yeah, I'm going to take that out. So that's kind of what you're going to see in here, but just know that my intention is once this dries is to take this all down to shadow back here, and keep only these parts intact the way that they are. So the area of the photograph, I'll bring up the photo before I stop this video, has like this box in the background that was painted a tan color. And so that's kind of what you're seeing in here is me laying in some of that. I lightened up the areas in here and warmed them up a little bit where they were right behind the bananas and at the edge of the shadow, the cast shadow that's going to end up being there. As you can see, I picked up just a tiny bit of cadmium yellow light and then more white and then more of this peach tone that I had mixed to kind of approximate that box color. So now I'm going through and starting to work on some of the lemons. I was letting the shadows kind of carry this initially, so that's why you see me starting with the light side. And it's kind of what you saw on some of these. I did block in a little bit of red here, but these I decided I wanted to start with hitting the colors in here and let the shadow tones that I had already masked in kind of carry them for me. So I'm just trying to approximate the correct colors that I want to hit. And then here you can see I've picked up just a tiny bit. You can even see it on my brush of the cadmium yellow medium. And I'm mixing it into this dark tone here to start kind of resolving that shadow and what tone I want in there. And then I picked up a little bit more of the tint and kind of picked that up to get the reflected light that's happening in the underside of that lemon that's down there. I used that same tone to hit some of these shadows, and then I noticed this pear had a little bit of that orange tone as well. And I wanted to kind of lock these all in so that they were the same colors, so I hit that really briefly there. Came back with another brush and started hitting back in some of my yellows. Notice I'm being very careful to keep these shadow areas and not let them go. And so immediately, even though these are very simply painted and have all of a couple minutes of painting on them, we still have a good feeling for how the light is coming through this. That's what I want you guys to really remember. Do not let go of the light and shadow as you're working through this. Then I pick up a little bit more of the cad yellow light, maybe a touch of white in there. I know I did move to white at some point. Here I'm moving over to the pear, which has a slightly more green tint to it. And so I picked up just a tiny bit of phthalo blue and mixed it into my cadmium yellow medium to get a little bit duller green, and then used that to hit some of the light areas on this side. And I wanted this to feel slightly greener than these yellows over here. Here's some of the warmer cadmium yellow medium down on the bottom. And then I block back into it. And I'm just working varieties of that green tone, which you can see the green a little bit more up here. And then the yellow, the warm yellow down here. I go back and I'm hitting some light tints to kind of go, okay, here's some light, here's some light, here's some light. Just to make sure that I'm paying attention to beginning to build the volumes. So you can see that happening within the pear, within the lemons. I hit just a little bit more light in there. And then I looked at these limes in the background. We have two of them. We have one right here and one right here. And I mixed a green using the, I used the phthalo green. The phthalo blue, but instead of using the cadmium yellow light that's really close to it and makes a brighter green, I used the cadmium yellow medium, which is a little bit more of an orange tone, if you remember. It's a little bit of an orangey yellow, and so it gave me a slightly duller green that was a little bit more realistic, but still had a lot of the bright green in it. Then I came back in. I don't know if you can see that on my brush, but the brush is loaded with yellows. And I came back in with yellows, and it's got a little bit of green on there, but it's got primarily kind of cad yellow lights. And I used that to mix into this area to start building the light side. So what I want you guys to understand is that notice that I'm not using one color to paint these. I'm moving often between my warms and my cools, depending on what the final effect is that I want. I'm moving between like greens that I've mixed and yellows. Um, Remember that this whole area here was the cad yellow medium with a little bit of phthalo blue to give me a duller lime green. And then here I mixed in with some of the cad yellow light to get some of the appearance of the light warm but cooler yellow. Okay, I wouldn't want the cadmium yellow medium here because it goes too orange too fast. And I don't want this to go orange. I want this, sorry, I want this to feel as if it's got warm yellow lights building on it. So you can see how nicely that cad yellow light feels like the light part of that lime. Then a little bit of white mixed in with my cad yellow light. Okay, and I use predominantly a little bit more white than yellow on this because I don't want this to get overly yellow and warm. I actually want a little bit more of coolness to that highlight as it comes up into the light. So I decided that some of this green would be really nice to touch into some of these areas of this turquoise vase that's here. So I hit little pieces of it. You'll notice when you look at the final painting that I lose some of them as well. But one of the things that I'm looking for is like if I've got a color in one place, where do I want that color in some other places to help start tying this together? I'm looking at the unity of this painting the whole time I'm building up the painting. I'm not focusing on one object, now let's go to the next object, next object. I'm kind of blocking these in very loosely, and as I finish blocking in an area, I might look at where could I hit some more of this color. Oh, up here. And you'll notice that I actually cooled it down and made it a little bit more green in some areas. And then eventually when I start moving it in, I make it even a little bit bluer. So this is where the bananas, these are bananas right here, and they go behind the turquoise vase and they turn very green within the photo reference that I'm using. This is the same file that you guys have to choose from. So up here I started hitting a lot more of the phthalo blue within there because I want more of a turquoise blue, and I did add a touch of black and then a touch of burnt umber to it because it was just a little too rich of a blue at some point, and I wanted to tone it down and get rid of some of the blue and have it feel a little bit more realistic. So there's a little bit of burnt umber mixed into this to quiet that color down just a bit. Phthalo blue is a really rich pigment, and it highly pigments other things as it moves into it, so you have to be careful and control it. So now I'm just going through, matching my photo reference and looking for some of the darker areas within here where I can put some of that blue, and we're basically at the end of this stop motion. This is where I stopped and I moved over to the zoom video. So let's pull up a couple of these and kind of look at them for a minute so you get an idea. This one was an earlier photo and this is a later photo. One of the ways I can tell the difference is just the fact that this plum is a lot more blocked in here, and then here it's got a little bit more resolution to what was happening with the lights. So let's kind of talk about this one for a minute though. Let's close these. Okay. So as we look at this photograph, oh, goodness gracious, I should have turned all this off. As we look at this photograph, you can see the background's been blocked in more, and then I was like, oh boy, I'm glad I did this and things will dry quick because I think I need to just get rid of all this. And that allows me to have this composition a little bit more strong, which I really like. I decided I was going to do some things with this, and I was like, no, I think I just want this in shadow, and I want this to really be my focus in here. So remember, that's part of the decision you can make with this painting. Here, as we look at this, you can kind of see like areas of the painting and the way that they're blocked in. So notice that I came back in with some cool greens, like slightly tinted, not as brightly tinted as these. And you can see here that I've got a little bit more blue on this side. So this is predominantly more of the phthalo blue rather than the green tone that has some yellow in it. And then I use that to hit some of this light area of the bottle. I let it be a little bit darker in here, and I used it to mix in some of these like darker but middle values that we have. There's a lot of this green because the light basically goes through this bottle and hits these transparent kind of shadows on the bananas. It's one of the things I really love about this photograph. So I came through with some of the same greens and then lightened them a little bit and dulled them out because I didn't want them to get too bright too fast and hit the feeling of this shadow that was casting on these bananas. separately I painted the yellow. So it wasn't like I painted this whole thing yellow and then hit these areas, okay? These were painted separately from the yellows. You can see that I hit a lot of like the cool yellow. I think the cadmium yellow light works really well for the bananas when they're in the light area. But there's a lot of these orange tones in the edges of my photograph. And so I use some of these orange tones here. Let me pull up this photo really quick. Wherever I put it, I think it's here on my desktop somewhere. My messy desktop. There it is. Okay, so this is the photo reference that I'm referring to and that you guys have the ability to choose. And I did crop down this photo from the original photo that I had there to look at. So this is the green like reflection basically or casting of the bottle that I'm seeing on here, and I definitely work on this some more, and it's going to be one of my focus pieces within here, so it'll get more work as I keep going. You can see what I mean about like the duller green here. It's got a lot of like warm yellows in it and then building up to more of a cool but yellow light on there. You can see this line right here. I've hit a little bit of a dull dark green for the shadow. At this point, I do a little bit more work on this in the final photo that I'll show you in a minute. And then some of those dull greens, very warm, a lot of like yellows in there. Here you can see like close up a little bit better some of the different objects in here. So you can kind of see the warm yellows down here, the greenier yellow tones up there. How I allowed some of that shadow tone that I had in the original block in come through and influence the yellows I put in here, and then I touched just a little bit of red in there, and you can see why I wanted that red to be there. Here's a close-up looking at the bananas as well, so you can kind of see the warm yellows, or not warm, sorry, the cool but yellower yellows, and then I used a lot of white just because the yellows get so washed out in these light parts here. Looking down here you can see the warm like cadmium tones, cadmium tints, and a little bit more orange. So I used a lot of yellow in that cadmium tint as I lightened it in some places. I allowed the shadow that was being cast right here to kind of stay in there slightly at this point. And then I started looking at this plum. I need to fix some things with the shade, with the shape, but this is also, this photo is taken at an angle, so it's not straight on as well as it could be. So, but you can see kind of the cool pinks versus the warmer reds that are happening, and hopefully you can see some of that. I resolved this better as I got to the final photo, but hopefully you can see some of that. And then up here, looking at the drapery, this is just very simply blocked in at this point. So let's leave that one, and let's pull back up. Oh, maybe it's still here. Yeah, it's right in front of me, and I'm not looking at it. Here's where, this is the final photo I took when I left the block in that day and left it to dry. So you can kind of see that this plum is definitely a lot further along at this point. I paid attention to things like I saw a little bit more warm red down here, as you can kind of see there's a little bit more of a crimson tone down here at the bottom of this part of the plum. I hit a little bit more like whites and grays. I actually mixed a violety gray tone, and you can see some of that violety gray kind of hitting here, referencing some of these reflections at this point. Very soft, but it's there. And this is all painted very thinly, so it gives me a lot of ability, first off, to let it dry more quickly, and secondly, to make adjustments and to move into it with other colors if I hit something too strong and I want to adjust it. You can see here with the apple that I've hit more warmth and that I've developed this light without overly mixing this white out. I want to keep this white somewhat contained because it obviously turns everything very pink. And if I spread this light around here, that's what I'm going to get, is a big pink highlight that doesn't feel correct. But I kept a little bit of white in there to kind of reference to this highlight. It's not finished by any means, and I wouldn't be doing a finished highlight at this point, but I do want to reference some of these things as I'm doing my color block in. I hit the stem in here. I worked a little bit more on some of the drapery down here, and then I hit a little bit more of this light up here. Very rough and very light at this point. The last thing I wanted to pull up was the palette image of once this palette was most the way. I took another picture of my palette as I got to the end. So, and one of the reasons I wanted to pull this up, because it shows you a little bit some of the mixing, since you can't see what I'm doing as I mix on the palette itself. So you can see that I've created this range of mixing between this cadmium red, mixing warm yellows and then lighter yellows, and whites into that. And I've got this whole range here. So when I want to hit something, I can pick up a little bit of this, or I can pick up a little bit of this, or a little bit of this. So that's kind of what I do. I'm not mixing piles. I've got so much paint and so many various colors I need to hit that mixing piles is a little bit problematic. The only time I mix a pile is like if I want to hit a certain color for drapery and I don't want to lose that color or have to remix and match it again next time, then I might mix a pile of like my main color for the light side of the drapery or my main color for the shadow side of the drapery. As we look down here, you can see these are my tones that I use for the background. These are some of my cooler blues, kind of cooler like minty blues that I used in that bottle. Here's some of my warmer greens that I mixed, or I should say cooler greens, green mixes and turquoises. These are some of my warmer greens. You can kind of see that this green right here is kind of dull. It's got a little bit of like browns on this end, a little bit less brown in here, and a little touch of blue, a little bit more yellows and whites down here, and I've got a warmer version and a cooler version. Over here are the crimsons and the reds, and then a little bit of kind of a dark, this is kind of the dark bottle color that I was using in here. So that's kind of what's going on with the palette. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. You can see I've got whites mixed into the reds. I also use just the reds like this for some of the drapery or the apples or whatever as well. These were some of the gray tones that I mixed for the plum. Okay, and they're very thin, and I used them very minimally to mix the plum. So hopefully that all kind of helps you understand the block-in a little better. Next time I work on this, I'll be taping once it's finished, and I can start working on actually completing it. Okay?